We will continue with the political disputes between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, and we will learn about the end of the Federalist Party. So in the previous lesson, we learned about how the XYZ affair, where France asked for a bribe from Charles Pinckney and two other Federalist representatives of the United States in order to see their president, that led to the Federalists wanting to declare war with France. The Democratic Republicans, however, did not agree with war with France and attacked John Adams and other Federalists in the Democratic Republican-controlled newspapers. Attacking a person in the newspapers or making them out to be a bad person is called vilifying. And they vilified President John Adams in their party newspapers. Well, this leads to the Federalists, who control both the House and the Senate, as well as has a Federalist president. John Adams was a Federalist. This leads to them passing two controversial acts called the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. These acts, which have been joined together in history, are called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed by the Federalists to stop the growth of the Democratic Republican Party and silence its newspapers. It became an imprisonable offense to violate the Alien Sedition Acts, and several newspaper editors, including Thomas Cooper, were jailed. Well, as we've discussed before, the Alien and Sedition Acts, specifically the Sedition Act, which was the act that made it illegal to print things about the government in the newspapers that were criticizing of the government, these were pointed out, rightly so, as a violation of freedom of the press from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they proposed a new theory of how states should react to the national or federal government. And in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they felt that states should have a right to nullify a law, a federal law, that they believe to be unconstitutional. This becomes the basis for states' rights and nullification. The dominant theme in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions is states' rights and a state's right to nullify a federal law. This, of course, stemming from the idea that the Articles of Confederation gave more power to the states. They probably said, see, this is why we had a weak government and a weak national government in the first place, so a national government cannot become tyrannical, because here's what we have going on here. We have a national government passing laws that take away the First Amendment. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were correct. Amendment 1 does say that all individuals, Congress, shall make no law establishing or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. In addition, there's freedom of religion and the freedom to assemble, known as the 5 freedoms in the Bill of Rights. The Alien and Sedition Acts would be the eventual undoing of the Federalists, and the Federalists as a party would be dissolved after the War of 1812. The controversy over the Alien and Sedition Acts would lead to the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800. The Napoleonic Wars continue, and America trades with both the French and the British. However, the British practice of impressment, or pressing into service American sailors they claimed as British citizens, became a major grievance. In our lesson, we will analyze these ideas today. So, once again, the Alien and Sedition Acts became a major source of controversy in the country. And eventually, we the people become mad at the Federalists, who they see as violating their rights. And the majority elects Thomas Jefferson as our third president. This begins the downfall of the Federalists. The people, of course, the people rule our country, an idea known as popular sovereignty. Well, as was said before, the Napoleonic Wars continue. And Europe is in chaos. Britain is at war with France. And the U.S. has declared neutrality, but they continue to trade with both Britain and France. This upsets both Britain and France, who would like the U.S. to trade with just one of them. Besides that, the British are being bad on the high seas. The British are engaging in what's called impressment. Impressment is pressing American sailors into service in the British Navy. This is pretty much how this would occur. The British warships were pretty much kidnapping American sailors out on the high seas and forcing them to serve on their naval ships. So, a British warship would pretty much go up to an American fisherman and kidnap him and say, "Hey, you're a British sailor." Like, "No, I'm not. I'm American. I'm American." Like, "Nope, you're British. Send a ship over and capture him." And they'd row over, capture him, and he would be pressed into service on the British warship. So, this idea of impressment was, of course, angering Americans, pressing American sailors into service in the British Navy. The French were not engaging in this. Now, this starts to anger some of Americans, especially those whose loved ones have probably been kidnapped and forced to serve on these British ships. Now, as has been a dominant theme, when a country is misbehaving, the first step that America takes is to use economics. And Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans seek to use economics to end impressment. Now, because the Federalists have lost favor with the public, the Democratic Republicans are now in favor of the House, the Senate, and we have a Democratic Republican president. And they seek to use economics, just like we do today, against countries that we would like them to change their behavior. And the economic sanction that we used against Britain to have them stop impressment was to pass the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act stopped all trade with both Britain and France. Now, the Embargo Act would be a serious consequence for Britain, who relied on the colonies, the former colonies, for many raw materials still, because mercantilism was going away. They were purchasing cotton from the colonies. They were purchasing other things. And they were shipped from New England. Well, being that the elite in New England made money shipping, when you cut off the market for their shipping, this devastates New England shipping. This New England, especially coastal Boston, being a Federalist area, they were not happy about the Embargo Act that destroyed their shipping. Well, this leads to the eventual war with Great Britain, which there were several reasons why people were calling for war with Britain. And those that were calling for war with Britain were known as the War Hawks. And this enters a new South Carolinian that we have not heard much about yet. This South Carolinian, who was a Democratic Republican, would become known as a War Hawk because he wanted war with Great Britain. This South Carolinian was named John C. Calhoun. Now, John C. Calhoun, a Democratic Republican, would be one of the War Hawks that wanted war with Great Britain. The War Hawks wanted the U.S. to go to war with Great Britain. And several reasons were for this war. One was the practice of impressment. People said the only way Britain's going to quit impressing our soldiers into service, or our American sailors into service, is through war. Another reason was, and from what I know this is partially true, they were urging the natives on the frontier to attack, promising support to the natives if they would open war. There's a warrior named Tecumseh who was from Ohio. I believe he was a Shawnee, as I've told you before. But he was trying to organize a native coalition to take back Ohio and Kentucky. And he was also trying to get the British as an ally. So the British were in talks, in negotiation with him and other natives, which was another reason to go to war with Great Britain. Last, there was an incident where the British fired on an American ship out on the ocean. So for all of these reasons, there were War Hawks who wanted war with Great Britain. And John C. Calhoun was one of these War Hawks. So, the British practice of impressment led to economics being first attempted by the American government to stop this. And the economic action that was taken was called the Embargo Act. An embargo is a stop of trade, and this stopped American trade with both France and Britain. This, however, devastated the American shipping industry, which was largely based in coastal New England. The Federalists opposed the Embargo Act and the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was urged on by war hawks like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. The Democratic Republicans living in the West accused the British of urging natives to attack American settlers. From what I know, that was probably true. The British then fired on an American ship, and protest meetings were held all over South Carolina. In 1810, John C. Calhoun was elected to Congress from South Carolina and urged Congress to declare war on Britain. Well, Congress, which has the power to declare war and was in the possession of the Democratic Republicans at the time, wanted to declare war. The Federalists and Alexander Hamilton said, "No, don't," but it was too late. In 1812, Congress, who has the power to declare war, part of federalism, passes the declaration of war, and war is declared on Britain. In this war, the U.S. invades Canada, and being that we are now fighting an offensive war and not a defensive war, we were soundly defeated. The British then go into Washington, D.C., and they end up setting fire to the White House. The British burned the White House. Only one thing survived, a portrait of George Washington that Mrs. Jefferson saved. Now, the results of the War of 1812, I believe they burned the Capitol as well. The results of the War of 1812, it was a British victory. But there would be several things that occurred. Even though the USA lost, there would be a new surge of nationalism where people were extremely proud to be part of the American nation. And curiously, after the British soundly defeated the Americans, there would be no exchange of lands. So in almost all of our other lessons, we learned about the victors of war usually gained land. In the French Indian War, the British gained a large amount of land in the Americas, including Florida from Spain, who got involved. Well, of course, in the American Revolution, the American colonies won their freedom and gained land. However, in the War of 1812, there was no exchange of lands. Now, this has become known as a status quo antebellum. Hopefully, you've already covered what antebellum needs in your English classes, because many people usually know that the antebellum period would mean before war. Status quo, roughly translated, means the way things are or were. Well, a status quo antebellum means that as far as land was concerned, it would stay as it was before the war. So, the British pretty much whooped us and said, "You learned your lesson." Now, an additional consequence of the War of 1812 is this war causes the Federalist Party to go away. They completely went away as a political party due to their opposition of the War of 1812. Also, the Democratic Republicans, now that the Federalists were not a political threat at all, In fact, they would come back as another named party, but the Federalist name would never be used again. They started to support some Federalist ideas, like the creation of the national bank and protective tariffs. Well, let's look at what the PowerPoint says here, and we will finish our lesson on the Democratic Republicans and Federalists. So, there's John C. Calhoun, and he is known as a war hawk, and eventually he will become a very important representative from South Carolina who would fight for states' rights and nullification, two ideas that were first brought up by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, fellow Democratic Republicans, in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, whose dominant theme was states' rights. The War of 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain and invaded Canada, but the American army was soundly defeated. In 1814, the British Army attacked Washington, D.C. and set fire to the Capitol and the President's house. The Treaty of the War of 1812 did not bring an exchange of land. Unlike most other wars, this is known as a status quo antebellum. The result of the War of 1812 brought a new surge of nationalism, and the Federalist Party died as a result of their opposition to the war. Last, Democratic Republicans, including John C. Calhoun, began to support Federalist policies, including a protective tariff and a national bank. This concludes our lesson on the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Of course, there were no more Federalists after the War of 1812, so the Democratic Republicans would be largely in power for quite a while. Until the next lesson, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.